Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and we're now a few weeks into what for all intents and purposes represents a truer sample size of Hasbro's vision for the franchise on television screens. Still a ways to go before we get a good look at what their plans are for the big screen and beyond, however. So let's not beat around the bush and jump right into answering this video's titular question, as we do every year. And I'd like to start with a couple of character details I thought were worth bringing up and expanding on. Our now 5-member team of Dino Fury has a fun mishmash of personalities that, so far, bounce off each other pretty well. I think there's a bit of awkwardness with some of the dialogue and how the characters are instructed to act it out, but it's rarely anything egregious. But the main thing that comes across to me are neat moments, like anytime Zato gets to excitedly react to things Izzy says before he realizes she's joking. Him asking if they had any dragons around here is probably my favorite bit of new Alien on the Block style dialogue we've gotten. And what works about it is having so much about these two characters specifically communicated to us by means other than just backstory. It does absolutely help that Izzy and Zato have the lion's share of focus to this point, but I think the character writing for them also does well all throughout the smaller moments. And it really fits, since their particular dynamic ends up being this old school, even-keeled yet excitable leader, trying and often humorously failing to understand the modern sarcastic sensibilities Izzy embodies. As such, their banter feels breezy and easy to hone in on, and the show seems to agree. The other notable dynamic between Amelia and Ollie comes off a bit undercooked by comparison, but comparatively, there is also so little done with the specifics of Amelia's out-of-the-box interests. So it's this odd situation where she comes off like a pretty standard Ranger character in both personality and aesthetic, in spite of being set up as anything but. And it's weird that she's really not weird enough, at least in my opinion, to make her particular contributions really stand out. Even in her own Focus episode, I'd argue her grandfather stole every scene they shared. The same could be said about Ollie, except the foundation of his character doesn't lend itself as much to the kind of episode someone like Zato would get. So it's hard to say what they'll even do with him beyond having logic duels with Amelia, which is certainly cute enough in its own right. And Javi, well, he's definitely in the show. I can confirm that he has lines, and even recites them. He even nodded once. Hey, that was really something. But in all seriousness, his story bit is just around the bend, so maybe if anything fun happens there, we can discuss that once the hiatus hits. Before discussing some notable episode story beats and breaking down the stupidest PR fandom controversy I've seen in quite some time, let's discuss the other side of the conflict. Every episode, I find myself increasingly entertained by Void Knight as just some space hobo who lives in a box of barely held together scraps with his zany friends. There is a lot of potentially creative avenues they have here, and the powers that be know that, so they're currently investing a fair bit into slowly teasing out whatever his deal ultimately ends up being. Boomtower is also hilarious, Mucus is even more hilarious, and even the Sporix beasts themselves have been one of the bigger highlights here. Between lying about having kids to getting disgruntled about people forgetting your name, most of them have more personality than even Ollie does. But it does beg an important question with how the Sporix were originally framed, because Zato describing them as this unstoppable plague of planet destroyers would naturally imply a much lower sense of individuality per Sporix. You'd think that given such a backstory, they'd act less like monsters of the week and more like the foot soldiers of every day. But I think the writers thought that wouldn't be nearly as fun, which, good point. So the question then becomes, how does one consolidate the idea of them being this invasive hive mind with how diverse their personalities, and perhaps more importantly, motives are? And is this something Dino Fury will ever consolidate? Or will this be the orgs all over again, where they're content with the origin just being flavor text as a means of giving the Sporix some weight as a threat? So it'll be interesting to see how that part of it plays out, and if it's something they'll ever address, all while the conflicting forces are essentially playing Pokemon with these Sporix eggs. Worth noting is that this season will be a 10 out of 10 if at some point the Rangers release their captured Sporix to fight on their behalf, and then set them free. Then Brain Blast can finally find a significant other. So right now, the villains to me are a yes, but. I'm loving the energy they bring, but I'm wary of what their inherent implications will end up meaning to the season as a whole based on how it's presented itself to this point. Either way, it'd be hard to complain, since it does feel like they carried over some of the aspects I loved most about the Beast Morphers antagonists. And I also get the feeling that I'm going to love when Weisel's counterpart gets here even more. Now let's discuss bits from the episodes we've gotten so far that I liked or didn't in no particular order. I like the fact that Lost Signal takes the time to focus on what Zato's lost, fittingly enough, and how it drives him in the now. It evokes what still stands as one of my favorite scenes in Dino Fury, where Zato needs a moment to handle everything that's happening in the now. And episodes like this build off smaller moments like that, where I get a genuine sense of longing buried inside that strong-willed, put-together exterior that Zato usually feels he needs to have. Unless he's getting excited by dinosaurs, of course. I unironically like Brody Romero, and I promise this is going somewhere, because he's a weird goofball that doesn't know how to human, like a discount Dex from Masked Rider. But one of the things that always struck me as unfitting is how disconnected he felt from a past largely defined by his servitude to Galvanax. And that's with Redbot and Mick right there with him, as supporting characters with a shared history. Which is why one of Ninja Steel's best moments is when Aiden happens, because that's one of the only times the Brody we see now feels connected to the Brody we saw then. So by comparison, I think the way Zato is written for already, in addition to the fun character quirks, conveys a lot more attention paid to that detail, which is very much appreciated. I also think J-Borg is a legitimately great addition to the cast, but unfortunately, this also means that now we have to dig into the fact that Andrew Hartford, for reasons, decided to market his coping mechanism sometime after finally achieving the dream of having a fully human son. It's exceptionally strange, as ham-fisted references go, and a far cry removed from the way I praised the creative incorporation of PR Tales of Old way back in episode 1. That having been said, I still think it works out just fine in spite of all that, because, for the time being, I feel I need to stress, Dino Fury is backpedaling on all the confused, at times nonsensical, takes on AI their predecessor settled them with. So J-Borg getting to just be a cyborg who is immediately accepted as a legitimate BuzzBlast employee is a nice escape from all of that. And it feels much more in line with how I praise the idea of Robo Knight's inclusion, because said inclusion is built off the understanding that no one is blind to his robotic nature, but his not being a human is never a point of contention. That is, until the villains specifically make it one. So you have your character-specific jokes and quirks, naturally, but nothing even so much as peeking into the realms of incidentally malicious. So, yeah, keep doing you, J-Borg, you wonderful aspiring reporter you. And I guess there's no avoiding it. So let's discuss what somehow wasn't an early April Fool's joke with the skirt. Now, I've seen some terrible takes in this fandom before, but the mental gymnastics some people went through to try and dogpile on a completely harmless scene is morbidly hilarious. We have such brilliant reasons as, let me check the notes, here we are, not being logically consistent. Of course, because that's where PR has always excelled. Well, let's see here. Not being set up through the story in any particular way. Oh, how could I have missed that? Because not liking an article of clothing absolutely needs a 15-episode backstory about how Izzy wore one once, fell into a lake, thus traumatizing her sociopathic father into believing that if you ain't first, you're last. I mean, seriously, I shouldn't even be talking about this. I shouldn't have to defend why this scene has meant and could mean a fair bit to those who watched it. Like it, love it, hate it, whatever. There are plenty of people who do have legitimate reasons for feeling any of these three ways, or more. But the fact that this 3-second clip was framed by far too many as the only noteworthy thing that happened in the best episode so far is insane. And I wouldn't even mind it as much if the folks talking about how this moment talked down to them for some ass pull of a reason weren't acting younger than the kids this show is written for. I'm sure most fans have long since moved on, as is the healthy thing to do. But can we just collectively decide to be better than this next time? Please? Speaking of that episode, New Recruits kicks ass. It features some of the most creative fight choreo of the season thus far, in addition to formally presenting current character powerhouse Izzy in all her glory. And does this episode ever give her a supremely strong first impression? And with a trio that was a tad bit on the stilted side, I would argue they needed what the siblings Garcia provided sooner rather than later. I also like the recurring joke of New Rangers being excited by Zords, and that even without their own Zords as of that episode, Izzy and Javi still get to join in on the fun. All of that ends up being even more necessary when we think about how the very next episode doesn't really convey her in the best light, though I think the issues I have with winning attitude extend a little past that. Let me start off by saying that I love the fact that PR created an entire episode just to spotlight the Special Olympics and prominently feature the character of Lily. It's a beautiful sentiment just on the face of it, but Lily being a legitimately great member of the cast adds even more to it. But looking beyond that, the episode as a whole kind of falls apart, but not in the way a lot of viewers seem to be focusing on. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with Izzy not being some perfect angel. If anything, I find her more interesting because she lets her competitive side negatively impact those around her, and the show does not frame that as a good thing. But what I actually didn't like about this episode is how oddly put together it felt. This new girl we know nothing about, and who has done nothing to earn anyone's ire, is presented as this big moral quandary for Izzy, when it's really not. Of course she's going to help her, there's zero tension built into any of that. And it's equally as silly when the idea of her needing to be first place and break records and all of that jazz is abruptly flipped, when convenient, to be all about always finishing a race. And speaking of actually weird framing, we're expected to buy into Papa Garcia's pride in Izzy while also having him insist that she'd better win next time? What are we even supposed to take from that? If anything, his insistences directly created the pressure Izzy feels to compete at the highest possible level all the time, which in turn leads to lashing out. It's like the first half of the episode never communicated with the second half, so what we get is a tale of two Garcias, where Izzy's negative qualities are conveyed as such, but the factors are never honestly addressed before we just move on. And also, Javi is there. All in all, I think Dino Fury has mostly been a fun ride thus far. The characters are neat, the villains rock, and it usually doesn't bite off more than it can chew in terms of presenting its various stories. When this isn't the case, it naturally begets many weird implications, most of which will never be addressed properly, if at all. But that too is part of the charm of Power Rangers. So while I am still somewhat critical of some of what we've gotten so far, taken together, there is really only a handful of things I would change or would really want to see focused on more. So, with all that said, what are your thoughts on the season thus far? Are you vibing with Dino Fury, or is it still missing something for you? Let me know down below. And while you're down there, feel free to like this video, assuming you actually liked the video. And until whenever the next time I post a video is, thanks for watching.